Hi guys, and welcome back to the stool testing series. In today's video, we're going to be going over another whole genome shotgun sequencing test. This one is Psomagen. The GutBiome Plus is the name of the test. We are going to contrast this quite a bit, compare and contrast with the Biome FX, which was the most recent video that I uploaded for you guys. We're going to talk about the pros and the cons of both. I think that they both have a place. I will probably end up recommending this particular test a little bit more, and I will tell you about that just momentarily. So let me go ahead and show my screen. And here we go. So this, and I will start by pointing out again that keep in mind, stool is not a homogeneous substance. So you are going to get variations in the report with each sampling. And this was also taken about 2 months, maybe actually 3 months after I did the Biome FX. Honest to God, when I sent off the Biome FX and the GutZoomer, they looked so great. I thought for sure I was just going to use one of those, and that was going to be the end of this series. But no, I actually felt the need to do another round of testing and explore another potential test. So here we go with the Psomagen GutBiome Plus. Now this, as a side note, I had already been familiar with Microba. This is an Australian company, and I actually had, I was looking for a stool test for a patient in Australia to do, and I came across this test, and when we got the report back, it was so insightful and so helpful. I was really, really pleased with it. So when I saw that Psomagen was basically partnering with Microba, and that was how they were doing the test, I was really excited. So, you know, I know the Cosmos ID is a great company, and I really wish I loved that other test a little bit more, but I also think really highly of Microba. I've had some really useful testing experiences with them. Now, we have to scroll through the first couple pages because they give you a lot of reading material, which you could do on your own time. They tell you about the microbiome, what they're testing, why it matters, yada, yada. Let's see. The method. They actually have 2 different tests, and I will do another video on their other test. We are looking at the GutBiome Plus right now, so they give you a little bit of a comparison. Okay, let's go down, down, down. All right, test results, and here we go. So here is the actual test results for me, and there's one little like formatting confusing thing that I'll point out to you in just a second. So basically, here we go. We get the overall gut health score and their healthy range. So down here is 34 and this is 63. And you can see I'm right in the middle of that at 48. Again, as somebody who had like truckloads of antibiotics in my youth, 48 is not so bad. I would like to improve it for sure, but I do think that that was a pleasant surprise. And then we can come down here and we can see they give you, again, a nice little summary page. Not quite as nice as the Biome FX, but it is a nice little summary page. And you can see they give you good stuff on this side and potentially bad stuff over here. Now, the thing that confused me about this a little bit is in my mind, you would put results in red if they were abnormal or like really bad. Kind of, you know, like an F if you're in school. So they don't always do that. Like you could see human DNA detection was in the normal range, but they still put it in a red font. So that threw me off just a teeny bit as an example over here. And we'll see that again in other parts of the report. But just so you know, red doesn't always mean that you scored really poorly on that. It just means that they have the potential to reduce your health. So I'm kind of getting used to that reporting. But you can see over here, lo and behold, this company says that my butyrate production is great. Higher than normal even, which I found very curious considering our other test results that we just talked about in the last video. My propionate production is on the lower end of normal, but still okay. My acetate production looks like it's on the higher end of normal, which is surprising since I don't really have a ton of lacto or bifidobacteria. There must be other bacteria that make acetate that are getting along just fine. Fiber degradation. Again, I mentioned this with the saccharolytic fermentation part of my Biome FX. This is more in line with what I expected based on how I eat, because I eat quite a lot of fiber and whole grains, and you know, I really try to feed my butyrate producers a lot. So higher end of normal is more in line with what I was expecting. The microbial diversity you can see is on the lower end of the normal range, so that's a little bit I need some work on that for sure. And then IPA production, that's not IPA beer, by the way. That is right about in the middle, so that's fine. Then coming over here, here's some potential, potential things that could reduce my health. LPS production, you can see, is quite high. So that's like, yikes. We're going to talk about where that 10% comes from. It's actually one bacteria that's elevated that much. So I'm currently working on that, actually. Trimethylamine production is on the higher side. So that's TMA. That's a potentially inflammatory compound. So that I've got to keep in check. Protein degradation. Again, I was surprised that the BiomeFX said that this was low normal on me as well, because we don't shy away from protein in our house. We have, some sort of protein source at every meal. I do, collagen peptides a couple times a week. Like, I was surprised that that was lower end of normal. So this is, again, more reflective of what I would expect based on the way I eat to be higher end of normal, but still not elevated. So I was happy with that. And then human DNA, like I said, these last two are actually in the normal range. So don't get thrown off by the red. This is the most depressing part of the profile for me. So just run with me on this one. Look, they look at the really important species within Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus, and you can see none detected, none detected, none detected, none detected, none detected. Again, for those of you who don't know me and you haven't followed my videos before, I joke that I had about 87 humans worth of antibiotics in my childhood, in my lifetime. I was a chronic ear infection kid, and then that morphed into the chronic allergy and sinusitis adult. And I probably, honest to God, I think I had at least 2, if not more, rounds of antibiotics every single year up through probably my mid-20s. It wasn't until I think it was my mid-20s when I discovered, surprise, I'm a celiac, and I didn't know. And also, by the way, my body like super hates dairy. It wasn't until I made those 2 shifts and I cut out gluten and cut out dairy that my sinusitis cleared quite drastically. And for all that I'm still a little bit drippy and nasally and mucousy, this is way better than what it was when I first was on this healing journey. So for me, I see this stuff and it's one of those like you either laugh or you cry about it situations. So I'm choosing to laugh because I'm just like, of course I don't have any of them left. I was a product of the modern medical foyer into overuse of antibiotics. And sure enough, I have none of those good bacteria left. So I need to be mindful of taking probiotics. And in honesty, I've been a little bit lackadaisical about that in the last, 10 years. I've gotten better about it in recent years, but I have been a little bit lackadaisical about it. So this just proves to me that I really need to be much more diligent about my probiotics. So you can see none detected on any of them. All right, now moving on to happier things. This was neat. They actually do this on their other test, the other Psomagen test, and they give you basically these different directions your microbiome could go. And you can see that they're labeling me as type 2, a fiber favorite, because I do have some Prevotella. What's interesting too is on the BiomeFX rather. Sorry, I'm like getting them confused. The BiomeFX, they detected 0% Prevotella. But on 16S testing and other tests I've got back, I always have a little bit of detected Prevotella, funny enough. So that was the only test that didn't detect any Prevotella in my sample, which is unique. But these guys, they did pick up on some Prevotella, which is more my typical. And you can see I actually have a pretty even smattering of all of these, but they're still labeling me as the Prevotella fiber favorite type. So, neato. I guess because I'm, kind of on the higher end of the normal range, versus you could see the average for Bacteroides is 12 and I was only at 7. The average for Ruminococcus is 9.5 and I'm only at 9. So I guess I'm like the closest to the average on Prevotella. So that's why they gave that label to me. And again, you could read about this. I'm not going to bore you. They give you the subtypes. My subtypes are then protein favorite and then omnivorous. So you can read about that on your own too. They give you the section on lifestyle. And again, coming over here, this was interesting because GABA production specifically on the BiomeFX was labeled as the 0th percentile. And they actually give me quite a lot more credit for that, which now again, I don't know how much I want to read into this as far as like anxiety goes. But I would tell you for what it's worth that I have virtually no overt anxiety. I mean, I have stress, But if I'm going to, go on either end of the spectrum, I'm going to dwell on the past and lean more towards depression, if anything, if I'm in a funk. I tend to not have overt anxiety. I live with somebody who does. So I see it and I know what it looks like, and I treat patients with anxiety all the time. So I know what it is, but I do tend to think that my GABA might be okay, which is more reflective of this test. Again, IPA production looked right about in the middle. And then vitamin B9 production, you can see, is on the higher end of the normal range, which I think is lovely. Now, if this gets really, really high, as a side note, sometimes they will look at particularly high folate levels in serum. So this is measuring the vitamin as opposed to measuring your production potential, right? Because again, we're looking at genes that make vitamin B9. But sometimes high levels of serum folate can be indicative of things like bacterial overgrowth or SIBO. So if this gets way higher than the normal range, then I would raise an eyebrow at it. But for right now, 60 versus 58, I'm actually not too worried about that. I'm just going to say hooray for me. The fatigue, this is interesting. They actually do make a point of differentiating between D-lactic acid versus lactate overall. So I thought this was a really useful part of the test, particularly for anybody with chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, anything like brain fog, which I do struggle with, fatigue certainly also. So I thought that this was really relevant for the D-lactate production piece of it, because I know that's really a hot topic in the SIBO world. And you can see that mine is right about in the middle, so I can't really point a finger at D-lactate for my fatigue levels anytime soon. Darn it. Sleep, again, you can see they give you these nice little sections. So my sleep looks okay on paper. You can see my GABA production is right in the middle. My butyrate production is high, and my propionate production capacity is like low normal. So if anything, I could work on propionate and maybe a little bit of GABA, but I don't think that's as big of a thing for me. I've actually tinkered with GABA. It doesn't do much for me. So you can see they give you that nice little, area for sleep. As a side note, I will share with you, this is not the be-all end-all for sleep quality, and I can tell you that for certain because I have had lousy sleep for a while in some way, shape, or form. So I look good on paper, but I still have really lousy sleep. So just take that with, well, okay, that sounds so harsh. I wouldn't say I have lousy sleep. Anyway, that's a whole nother video. Healthy weight. Again, now this is where they started to throw me for a loop, because I was like, ooh, my methane is flagged as red. Oh my God, I'm bad. But they're giving you this key of the things that are red have the potential to reduce your health. So generally you don't want those to be high. But I saw this and I was like, oh God, this is abnormal. But then you look and I'm like, oh, I'm good. And again, they give you butyrate and propionate. Again, same information, but it's important for weight purposes also. And methane, if you have more methane production, that can be detrimental if you're trying to lose weight. Now, as a side note, I will say I tend to be constipated. So methane production being at 0 was curious. I mean, I will say that parallels, I've done a SIBO breath test and I had not really any substantial methane production on a breath test. And other testing that I've done over the years tends to not really show methanogens in a high level. So this does parallel other tests. And it just goes to show you there's other reasons that you can be constipated other than methane. So it looks like if I were to try to reduce my methane producers, that probably would not benefit the constipation. And I will tell you, I have tried that and it did not work for me. I've tried doing, the probiotics and the fiber types and the PHGG. I've tried doing all of that to reduce my methanogen growth, just in case that was my cause. Didn't do a lick for me. So I will confirm that. Now we look again. This is similar to what we were talking about before with the GutBiome FX. They look at some nutritional things. Again, fiber degradation, fiber breakdown, higher end of the normal range. I am just tickled pink with that. Protein breakdown, higher end of normal, but not yet out of the range, I think is fine. Basically, if this gets really high, like if this is creeping up above their, 77 range, for example, I would start to think more along the lines of you're either consuming too much protein or your stomach acid is not adequate and you're not breaking it down. Because really what they're showing here is that it's the genes that are responsible for protein breakdown by your microbes. And that, in a nutshell, we're talking about protein that escapes your digestion and makes it down to the colon to feed your microbes. And ideally, you shouldn't have too much protein making it down to your colon. If you do, you're either eating way too much or you're not breaking down the protein adequately that you're taking in. So that, and this is curious too, because I recently did start on betaine HCl again, in part because of this number being high end of normal, and in part just for some other stuff in my life. I thought I needed some betaine HCl for a while. So kind of interesting. That lines up a little bit more with what I would expect. Again, starch breakdown, I was surprised when I saw that was low on Biome-FX, judging by the way I eat and what I know about the microbiome. This is more reflective of what I would expect. So this, as somebody who eats a fair amount of complex carbohydrates and starch and like trying to feed the butyrate producers, the higher end of normal is more in line with what I was expecting. Then alcohol metabolism. This was kind of interesting because I'm not a drinker. Really, I mean, I will have one glass of something every other month, maybe. I'm not big on the alcohols. I never have been. Even when I was the age-appropriate age to like alcohol, I never really cared for it that much. So it's interesting that I have really strong alcohol degradation genes in my gut microbiome. It probably means I could consume more alcohol if I wanted to. I just don't really care for it typically. So yeah, I mean, that was interesting, but that I'm not utilizing that skill, I guess, is the best way to say that. And then formaldehyde degradation, yuck. It just makes me think of the cadaver lab, but that was also high end of normal. I think that's fine, as I'm not really worried about this. Now, this is interesting for me on a personal note. And I'll do another video or video series on oxalate someday for you guys. Oxalate consumption is a big topic, particularly, I've seen it a lot in the autism community, in the fibro community, big time, interstitial cystitis. There's a lot of communities where oxalate can become a big deal. Obviously, kidney stones, that should go without saying. But oxalate can be very inflammatory and cause a lot of grief for you if you have too much of it. And ideally, if you consume oxalate in the form of things like spinach or almonds or bran or rhubarb, you would hope that your microbiome can break it down for you. So it's really nice that they give you this. And you can see that my gut microbiome is in a nice position to break down oxalate, which I was very happy for, because as a side note, I did have high oxalate on an organic acids test in recent years. I think I had two different samples that confirmed high oxalates. And for me, treating my candida was what brought down the oxalate. So I was curious getting that result back a couple years ago with the organic acids test. I was like, well, is it because of the candida that's also seen here on the test? Or is it because my microbiome has been decimated by a lifetime of antibiotics and I no longer have the ability to mop it up from the microbiome perspective? So this test strongly suggests to me that my microbiome actually does an okay job breaking down oxalate. That probably was just purely the candida that was churning out oxalate for me. So that was useful for me to see here too. And that is something that we have not seen on other tests yet. They do, on the Genova GI effects, they do test for oxalobacter, which is one bacteria that is known to degrade oxalate, but it's also not the only bacteria that degrades oxalate. So I actually prefer that they give you this kind of broad, broad marker here. I think that's nicer, more useful. All right, then metabolic supply. Some of these, again, we've already talked about a bit. And again, they give you readings, so I'm not going to bore you with too much of this, but GABA and IPA we've already talked about. Butyrate we've already talked about. Lactate production. So remember, I mentioned that the other test, the Biome-FX, did not differentiate between D and L lactate. This test does. So they give you overall lactate production. So this would be made by things like lactobacilli, as an example, and this would regulate the pH of your colon and keep it nice and acidic. So I want lactate overall to be higher end of normal, which it is, which is great, but I want D-lactate to be on the lower side. And you could see back up on that other page, they specifically look and said that my D-lactate production was in the normal range. So that was lovely. And I'm really glad that they differentiate between the two. Then we get into propionate. We already talked about a bit. That's another short chain fatty acid. They give you more of a breakdown, again, paralleling what you would see, for example, on the Biome-FX. So the vitamin B2 production, high end of normal. B7 production on this test was high end of normal, which is very curious because it was low end of normal on the other test. Vitamin B9 production, high end of normal. Vitamin B12, high end of normal. Vitamin K production, actually high. So those are all great. Now, again, you still need to consume these vitamins from your diet, right? And like take a multivitamin or something. So it's not to say that you're off the hook and you don't have to take a vitamin if you have bacteria. Really, what this is going to be more reflective of is that these bacteria are making vitamins for each other and then they're feeding each other. Now, I will say this too. There is no vitamin B1 thiamine marker on here, and there's no B5 and B6. So to their credit, the BiomeFX tests for more vitamins than this test does. But you can see that they still test for a fair whack of the vitamins that your gut microbiota produces. So it's still pretty darn good. Then we get down here, the branch chain amino acids, and you can see mine is kind of higher end of normal. Again, IPA makes the scene yet again. Those look fine as they are. Metabolic concern, and you can see they give you these nice little like easy peasy numbers here too. Metabolic concern, again, when I saw this I was like, oh no, they're all abnormal, I'm doomed. But remember, these are just the bad things potentially. So we already talked about acetate, butyrate, lactate, propionate, vitamin B9. Those all look pretty darn good. My ammonia production is high end of normal, which I'm not overly keen on. My histamine production, this is actually an interesting one too, because this is a very hot topic within the world of the gut microbiome, is whether or not you have a microbiome that favors making or degrading histamine. Well, this test actually can help you understand that. I do kind of wish that they gave us more of a background of what exactly they're looking at to determine these numbers, like what bacterial species, for example, are producing histamine, but I'm going to take what I can. Mine looked low end of normal, so that was good. Human DNA was fine. They just, if you're like pooping out a whole lot of human DNA, then I would worry about a lot of epithelial damage, for example. LPS production is high. That's very concerning to me. And then protein degradation we already looked at. So we're going to zoom in on this LPS thing in just a moment here. Gas, again, they are looking at a couple of different things. They look at ammonia, methane, and they do give a measurement for hydrogen sulfide. Now, what's interesting, and I mentioned on this other video for the BiomeFX, for the BiomeFX, they did detect Bilophila wadsworthia, and they specifically pointed it out. And then in another page, they said that I had no hydrogen sulfide production genes. And I was like, that's weird. For this test, they don't specifically tell you if they're looking for Bilophila or Disulpha vibrio or a different species, but they do give you this. And interestingly, they did say that my hydrogen sulfide production was a bit elevated. So that's something I'm going to be working on. I'm already working on it, actually. So that was something interesting for me. I don't know which one is more accurate. I don't tend to have a lot of the hydrogen sulfide symptoms other than brain fog and fatigue, but I'm still going to be plucking away at it a bit, and I'll be doing a retest at some point down the road as well. Trimethylamine production, again, I mentioned before, this is the precursor to TMAO. This is something that is particularly relevant with cardiovascular disease. So that is useful, particularly for that crowd. It is inflammatory. I don't want it to be elevated, so I'm going to be working on that a little bit as well. GABA consumption. This is very interesting too. They actually label, so we've talked about GABA production on other parts of the test, like the sleep portion, for example. But they have another thing entirely down here, GABA consumption. Because remember, these bacteria, really, they're not trying to feed us. They're trying to feed each other. And there's a lot of cross-feeding. So you could see, my GABA production was normal, but my GABA consumption is quite high from my microbiome perspective. So maybe I could use more of those GABA producers like the lactobacilli, which I have basically zero of. So that I did think was helpful. Diversity, 66. I would take that, right about in the normal range. As somebody with my degree of history, I was pretty happy with that. Now this was a little bit of a bummer. I really wish that they would give us a phylum overview. Instead, they give us the breakdown of bacteria, archaea, eukaryotes, human DNA, and novel DNA. And that is not as helpful for me, to be quite honest. So this is a little bit disappointing. If they would just replace this with the phylum data, I would be much more happy with it, but it is what it is. And then we come down here. So this is all of the microbes that they tested. And you can see actually they do a lot of different bacteria that they don't really talk about in the rest of the test. And for somebody like me, this is relevant and neat. For example, here are a couple of yeast species, and you can see that all of these were not detected. So they were in the average range for me. So Candida albicans being the famous one. And then a couple of other yeast species. So none of those were detected. Actinobacteria, for the most part, these are going to be your Bifidobacterium species. And you can see this Bifidobacterium adelentensis is high. And this other one that I've actually never heard of is high. And then otherwise, on the other page where they actually looked at like the species that seemed to matter more, I didn't have any of those Bifidos. So kind of interesting. Now for this, I'm trying to think of the timing. I had started dabbling a little bit in taking some XOS powder, which is very bifidogenic. So I wonder if I had given these guys a boost. Because just taking these two numbers alone, if this is implying that on my own I have 1.7% bifidobacteria, like that is the best number I've ever seen ever, for me at least. So I don't know. I think that's got to be that I was starting to take that XOS supplement and I was feeding them already by this point. I know for sure I was not taking probiotics. I made a point of not taking probiotics or eating yogurt prior to this test. But I do think I had started taking XOS a little bit at that point. Let's see. Moving on. We've got some bile consumers, allostipes. And you can see both of these are in the average zone, so I'm not too worried about those. Quite a bit of different Bacteroidetes were tested. You could see B. vulgatus is one that I tend to monitor quite a lot, and that was right about in the normal range, so I'm not too worried about that. But that is something that I tend to keep an eye on and just make sure it doesn't get too high. Prevotella, again, I mentioned that most tests pick up a little bit of Prevotella for me, so Paraprevotella and Prevotella were both flagged as high, which is unique. They actually do test for blastocystis, which is a parasite, but they think now it might actually not be such a bad guy after all. That's a whole nother video topic for another day, but you can see I didn't have any of those tested, so that's all right. And then we get down to, we start getting into like anaerostipes. Basically, once you start hitting the Firmicutes section, you could start thinking of butyrate producers for the most part, or short chain fatty acid producers. Again, not all of them will be, but for the most part, you're going to look at those. So anaerostipes is a butyrate producer. You can see that's high. Belautia, high, and some of the subspecies are all high. Coming down here, more Belautia species are either average or high. Butyrococcus is average. I'm not sure what these are, so I'm going to skip over those. Coprococcus is another butyrate producer, and that was average. So you can see that they give you quite a lot of information here. You've got Eubacterium, a couple different ones that were detected. And now this is the coolest part of the test, in my opinion, and this is why I was excited to do this one. This was the part of the test where I was trying to confirm or deny the confusion from the Biome FX, and it's all right here. Faecalibacterium prausnitzii A, B, and C. Basically, the one thing that I had in my mind when I saw that the Biome FX labeled me as having low butyrate production, but high Faecalibacterium, I was like, okay. The one explanation, which, side note, the dude who works for the company was not able to tell me this, but I was just like, there are different strains of Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, and strain A and B really don't make that much butyrate. I mean, they make a little bit, but not a whole heck of a lot. But Faecalibacterium prausnitzii strain C makes boatloads of the stuff. So I was thinking when I got that test back and it said I had high levels of Faecalibacterium prausnitzii and virtually no butyrate production, I was thinking, okay, maybe I just have like all of my Faecalibacterium prausnitzii is type A or B, and I have none of the C. And now it's stuck. But lo and behold, if you look, I not only have an average amount of type A and type B, I have a slight, but nonetheless, a high amount of Faecalibacterium prausnitzii C. So that really makes me lean more towards this test, thinking like, all right, they actually looked at the subtypes and they were able to tell me that I have normal or high levels of the ones that I wanted, along with, all of these Blautia species, Coprococcus, Butyrococcus, all of these other species. So I'm really, truly thinking that this test is more accurate for my butyrate scenario than the BiomFX, because they actually did parse this out, and this lines up with the rest of their test. So it makes a lot more sense. Marching on, we've got a couple more Firmicutes that I honestly don't know a whole lot about. Marching on, we've got again some Ruminococcus, Ruminoclostridium, some other butyrate producers, subdologranule. Oh, I forget how to pronounce that. Whatever. These guys all are things that I would normally tabulate when I'm looking at butyrate producers. Now you can see, by the way, if you look here, for example, you can see that some things are going to be shown as 0%, which is not detected, but then they flag it as average. So just know, like, you can look at the actual numbers of what was detected on your sample, and you can see like where exactly your numbers are comparatively. But that rounds out the Firmicutes group. The other thing that I want to really draw your attention to is the proteobacteria. And in this case, they only told us about 2 named species. So I'm going to be curious as I get more test results back in if they actually are testing for other proteobacteria or if these are the only 2 that they're testing for. I'm not really sure. But Escherichia coli, E. coli, you could see that it shouldn't be higher than 0.5%, and mine was 11%. Oh my gosh. So this is a big old LPS producer. It's a proteobacteria. So that automatically is relevant, and that's very high. So this is probably why I have high LPS production capacity on this test. So it's specifically E. coli for me. The other one, I know this one's flagged as high also, but that's small potatoes by comparison. E. coli does also produce hydrogen sulfide. So it's possible that this is where the hydrogen sulfide thing is coming from on this test, because they flagged me as high for that as well. I'm also curious if they are testing for Bilophila or Desulfovibrio, because I know that the parent company, when I've looked at microba tests from Australia, they do tend to test for Bilophila wadsworthia. So I'm curious if they just didn't put it in the American report for some reason or what. I don't know what. I still need to email the company and get back to them about that. But 11% E. coli is freaking not cool. And I'll say this too. This is one of the differences of technology. Something like Thrive or GutBiome when they existed, or even the other Psomagen tests that we'll review in the next video. Those are 16S detection techniques. And also the bulk of the GutBiome test is a 16S company. But then the pathogen part of it, they use PCR, I believe. 16S cannot measure E. coli because it looks too close to, I forget if it's Shigella or Salmonella. I think it's Shigella. And they basically can't tell apart the 2 bacteria. They're too genetically similar. So they make a point of not reporting either of those on a 16S test. It's just the technology is not there. With whole genome sequencing, you can. So that's why, maybe my proteobacteria look really good from a 16S perspective, because the nature of my overgrowth is E. coli as opposed to, something else, Desulfovibrio, Bilophila, Klebsiella, something else that they could detect with a 16S test. So for what that's worth, this was my biggest holy shit moment from this test, as well as just really backing up my suspicions of the discrepancy that I saw in the BiomFX. So for what it is, I thought that was really useful. And then they just give you a bunch of references. So overall, I would say this. This is probably going to be my whole genome sequencing test of choice to some degree. As always, there's no perfect stool test. There is no test that tests for everything, although there have been some attempts. Every test has their flaws. For this one, I like it because it's actually cheaper. It's about $150. You could get it on Amazon and you could get the kit in 2 days with Prime shipping. They test for a fair whack of stuff, and I felt like the metabolic capacity or like the genetic capacity really lined up with the bacteria that they said they were detecting, and like it made a lot more sense to me on this test as opposed to some of the discrepancies I saw in the Biome-FX. However, I am really sad that this particular test doesn't specifically say that they are detecting Bilophila or Desulfovibrio, and they're also not giving us a phylum overview. I would really, really, really like to see the phylum overview first and then get into the nitty-gritty of each of the bacteria. And I think that the supplementary material and like the educational material was much more compelling on the Biome-FX because they give you a lot of charts and they give you a lot more like written out information about like what bacteria make what substance and yada yada. So I liked that on the Biome-FX. But overall, even though this test really doesn't look at a lot of pathogens other than E. coli, and they don't give us the phylum overview, I thought that it did a really nice job otherwise. So probably going forward, what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine this test with something like Thrive, a 16S test, and then use the two of them together as far as trying to get a sense for the whole ecosystem. And then believe it or not, the cost of that will end up being about the same cost as a Biome-FX. If I'm suspicious of pathogens, I will have to order another test. If I'm suspicious of like digestive juices and inflammatory markers, will have to order that as a separate test as well. But I think as far as like the patients who I feel like I need to assess the good bacteria, I'm going to rely probably on some combination of this and the Thrive Inside 16S test for the time being at least. Now, this company, Psomagen, also has a 16S test, and I'm going to show you really briefly what that looks like in the next video. I was not super impressed with it. So I will show you in a short video why at this point I'm not recommending that test from Psomagen, but I did really enjoy the results from their whole genome sequencing, their shotgun sequencing test. And also, as a side note, this came back way quicker. This test took about 2 weeks to come back in after I mailed it off, as opposed to the Biome-FX, which took 5 or 6 weeks. So I do think that that was also a major plus for this test. So that is my shtick on the Psomagen GutBiome Plus. Overall, it was a really nice test for about $150 US, available on Amazon. You could get it for 2-day Prime shipping, and they give you a lot of usable information, I thought. So all in all, I was really pleased with this test. Hey guys, if you liked this video, be sure to subscribe, ring the bell, click the like button, and leave a comment down below with the videos that you would like to see me do next. Doing all of those really helps support the channel and support my efforts in making as many videos as possible for you guys. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.